Welcome to the Cultivation Cast by Black Dog LED with Kevin and Noah. In this podcast series, we will cover all things related to indoor cannabis cultivation. Welcome to the Cultivation Cast by Black Dog LED with Kevin and Noah. In this podcast series, we cover all things related to indoor cannabis cultivation. Thanks for the feedback. We continue to receive more feedback and questions from everyone out there. If you have any other questions or feedback or topics you'd like us to cover, please shoot us an email at podcast@blackdogled.com. That's PODCAST at blackdogled.com. This allows us to make sure that we get to the topics that you, our listeners, care about. So today we're going to cover questions about light movers. We get a lot of questions about sizing the proper light for an area, and we have done previous podcasts where we've covered that topic to a degree. But one of the questions we get a lot is with regard to light movers. So Kevin, we get these questions about light mover. What would you say the most common question is we get with regard to light movers?
I would say that in general, there's a misconception about what light movers can do, what they're useful for, as well as we get a lot of questions about, I want to use a light mover, or should I use a light mover? So there's a whole bunch of individual questions there which are all related and just are worthy of going over a general description of what light movers are good for, what they're useful for, what they're not useful for, and whether or not you want to use them in your space.
Great point. And I think the main thing we always want to get across, Kevin, is that they're not magic, right? So people will ask about light movers. Let's lay this out, and we're going to spend time covering this, but let me lay it out really simply, and that's light movers can change the shape of a footprint. They do not add any light to the fixture. The fixture is still going to put its light out. So you're just spreading it around in a different shape and a different intensity. Light movers do not magically increase the output of the light. Would you say that's true, Kevin?
No, it's absolutely true. And we get a lot of misconceptions. People see that, you can use a light mover to make the light cover twice as much area. And you absolutely can. But by doing that, you're making the light cover the area half as intensely. So it's not a magic bullet. You can't just magically get a light mover and double the area you're growing, because it doesn't work that way.
But there are benefits, though, right? Shadowing. Well, explain some of the real benefits to using a light mover, and we'll talk about changing the shape and making it bigger, or maybe using a light mover just to decrease shadowing and some of the other advantages. What are those advantages of having
so actually, let's just start with a basic explanation of what a light mover is for people that aren't familiar with it. A light mover is a mechanical device which physically moves a light fixture back and forth over an area. There used to be light movers on the market that worked more like a ceiling fan. It would actually swing your light around in a circle, or even two lights around in a circle over your plants. Those had one critical flaw, though. They're holding up heavy lights, and they've got to have a way of getting the electricity through to the lights. And that bearing, the circular bearing that they were using for that, had a lifespan that apparently was measured on the order of months. So there were these circular light movers on the market in the past. They worked very well until they stopped working and then dropped lights on the floor and started fires.
Or on your plants, which is even better.
Right. So the circular light movers don't really exist anymore, but for the past 25 years, actually 30 years now, Light Rail has been manufacturing light movers, and there are other copycats on the market at this point. But it's a simple little motor which hangs from an aluminum rail. The rail is nice and sturdy and straight, and the motor simply moves the light back and forth on this rail, and you can actually adjust how far it moves back and forth with little thumb screws. So it's literally just moving the light back and forth in a line. You can adjust the amount of time the light pauses at each end as it's switching directions, going back and forth, and it allows you to move the light back and forth and effectively change the shape of the light's footprint. Now, as Noah said before, lights put out a fixed amount of light. So, for example, our Phytomax 2 1000 can cover up to a 6.5 by 6.5 foot area. That's about 40 square feet of coverage for flower. That's the maximum flower area we would recommend. If you stretch it any more than that, it's not going to do a very good job. So that's 6.5 by 6.5 feet square. Now, if you had that same 40 square feet, but but you had it, for example, in a 4-foot wide by 10-foot long growing area, you could use a light mover to move the light physically back and forth over that 4 by 10-foot area, and you would get the same light intensity on average over that whole 4 by 10 foot area as you would over a 6.5 by 6.5 foot area without moving the light. So we're just changing the shape of the growing area, not changing the size. Now, if we use the light mover to move the light back and forth over a 12 or a 13 foot by 6.5 foot area, now we're suddenly covering 80 square feet, and that's not going to work in terms of giving the plants enough light to actually grow well. Now, if we put a second light on the light mover, so we've got twice as much light and we're just moving lights back and forth, that works. But what a light mover is good for is changing the shape of a covered area. What it's not good for is doubling or adding anything really to the actual area that you're covering, because it's going to decrease the total amount of light that the plants are getting. So why would you want to change the shape of a grow light's coverage area? Well, sometimes you've got, for example, a 2 by 4 foot tent or a 2 by 4 foot area, and you might want to use one light to cover that whole area. Where you could use 2 of our 200 watt lights to cover that 2 by 4 area, you could also use one of our 400 watt lights on a light mover and get exactly the same light intensity over that area. So it could be a little bit less expensive to buy a 400 watt light and a light mover than 2 200 watt lights and put them just statically hanging each over a 2 by 2 foot area. So there are some advantages to being able to change the shape of an area. The main point, though, the main reason why light movers can be really helpful is that by moving the light back and forth, they will eliminate shadowing to lower leaves on the plant, or at least reduce it as much as possible. Because when leaves are growing on plants, they will automatically orient themselves in such a way that they capture the maximum amount of light they can. That tends to make them automatically shadow out their own lower leaves. With a light mover, by physically moving the light source back and forth over the top of the plant, the leaves can't orient themselves in such a way that they automatically completely block all of the light to their lower leaves. So the light mover helps get better penetration deeper in the plant canopy by simply moving the light source back and forth and not having just one point source of light up above the plant. So for a single light, light movers can actually increase yield. We've seen 10 to 20% increases in yield by using a light mover just to move the light back and forth a little bit, eliminating shadowing in the bottom of the canopy. Now, if you use reflective materials around the side of your grow area, that does the same thing. It's reflecting the light back in from the sides, helping get more light to the bottom leaves. So that does a lot of the same job as a light mover will do. The one thing that a light mover can do that nothing else really can is it can actually help you get your light closer to your plants without, closer vertically to the plants without causing problems. So it's easiest to think about this as how the light needs to be set up to cover a particular area. So for all of our lights, the light is spreading out in a cone underneath the light, and it's spreading out to the sides. The further away you get from the light, the more it spreads out. So for all of our light sizes, if you want to have the light covering a 3 by 3 foot area, it needs to be about 21 inches above that 3 by 3 foot area to allow the light to simply spread out to the sides. If you want to cover a 4 by 4 foot area, you need to back the light up 8 more inches and get to 29 inches to allow it to spread out to a 4 by 4 foot area. So if you were using our Phytomax 2 1000 covering a 4 by 4 foot area, you'd want to have it 29 inches above the tops of the plants. And let's say you've got a very short growing area that you want to use, something that might only be 6 inches high, or 6 feet high rather. So you've got almost 3 feet that you need for the light and to allow the light to spread out to a 4 foot wide area. The thickness of the light plus that 29 inches, you've got about 3 feet that you're taking up that in your 6 foot tall growing area. So you'd only have 3 feet tall left for plants. One way you can cheat is to use a light mover. And instead of having the light covering 16 square feet, a 4x4 foot footprint, we can have the light mover move the light back and forth, for example, over 8 feet long and only covering 2 feet wide. Same 16 square feet. You're going to get the same light intensity over that 16 square feet. But now, instead of having the light needing to spread out 4 feet wide, we only need the light to spread out 2 feet wide under the fixture. And then the light mover itself is doing the physical action of moving the light back and forth 8 feet to cover that 8 foot direction. So when we only need to cover 2 foot width, the light can now be 16, 18 inches above the tops of the plants. And we've cut the area, the volume, the height that we need to have the light by half. So now you can get an additional 1.5 or 2 feet for your plants to grow in a very short growing area. So light movers can be very useful if you're extremely limited on vertical space. And if you've got only a single light, they can be very useful to help eliminate shadowing and get more light to the lower leaves. Of course, reflective materials around the side of your area can do that as well. But one other thing that light movers are commonly misconception about light movers is that, okay, to eliminate that lower leaf shadowing, I have to use a light mover on all my lights. And for a single light, one single point source of light, it's true that a light mover will definitely help do that. But in a larger facility where you've got multiple lights, the crossover effect that you get, being able to see multiple different lights from one position, from any single leaf down in the canopy, means that they're getting crossover light from other adjacent lights, and that's kind of replicating what a light mover would do. So as you're adding more lights to an area, the need for a light mover to eliminate that shadowing on lower leaves goes away. And once you get to 3-4 lights in a room, it really doesn't necessarily make sense to use a light mover anymore unless you need it for that extra vertical space.
So there's a lot of advantages having to do with light movers. What are some of the drawbacks? You know, we know there are advantages, and there's times you want to use them and times you don't. What are the drawbacks, or why maybe wouldn't we want to deploy light movers in a grow or in a particular environment?
So there are, when they're set up properly, there are almost no drawbacks. The light movers, if you get a good quality one, I've had them last 10, 15 years before the motors break, and they work very well. They're very reliable if you get a good quality one. And setting it up properly basically means that you're going to need to ensure that the rail that the light mover is actually moving on is very sturdily mounted and that it can't go anywhere. As long as it is very sturdy and very secure, it will move the light back and forth perfectly. It needs to be perfectly level so that it can go back and forth without straining itself. But if you do that, it works great. Of course, if the light rail is not actually mounted in a perfect, ideal manner, if it's, for example, not quite level, or it's not really securely mounted to a ceiling, for example, if it's hanging from some tent poles, the action of moving the light back and forth can cause the rail to walk or to move over time. And if it walks off the end of your support and then suddenly drops your light on top of your plants, that's not a good thing. So the light rails really do need to have a completely 100% secure location. They do make hangers for using them in tents. We would generally recommend still mounting the rail to a board and then very, very securely hanging that from the tent. Although in general, it's my feeling that tents wobble just enough that I wouldn't be that comfortable using a light mover in a tent. Now, I say this as someone who's used light movers and still does. I've used them for 25 years now to move lights back and forth because I'm using them to minimize the amount of vertical distance I need to have between my lights and the tops of the plants, because I'm growing extremely large plants in a 7-foot tall basement. So light movers are definitely something I use and recommend in the right situation. But a tent, I would be very, very nervous about putting a light mover in. Secondly, with the light movers, one of the things that most people don't think about until you're faced with it yourself is by moving the light back and forth, you have to have the cord for the light, the power cord, hanging behind the light somewhere. And that's going to hang in a loop that as the light mover moves closer to the outlet, the cord is going to hang down more. And as it stretches out further away from the outlet, the cord's going to get more taut and more tight. So you're going to have this cord also moving up and down in your growing area as the light mover is moving back and forth. Now, that cord can snag on things and can grab branches of plants sometimes, and it actually is some work to make sure, and it's an ongoing thing, to make sure that that cord is not getting in the way and tearing things off your plants as light mover is moving back and forth. And of course, if that cord gets caught on something that doesn't allow the light mover to move the light, that can cause the motor to burn out or can cause other problems there. It's not going to start a fire or anything like that, but it could definitely cause the light to stall in one spot over your plants. When your plants are used to the intensity being spread out, if the light suddenly stalls in one spot, you can essentially cook the plants that are immediately underneath the light when the light mover stops working. So being able to properly festoon the cord is actually probably the second most challenging thing behind getting the rail mounted perfectly securely and flatly to the ceiling.
So one of the things is we sell, the light mover with heavy duty wheels added in, so as you mentioned, the one that we believe in is Light Rail by Gualala Robotics. You can find it on our site if you happen to be online right now listening to this podcast. If you hover over the products menu, the very last item is light mover, and that takes you to a page where we list all the parts we sell. We sell the complete kits, but on the complete kits, we don't sell the stock kit because it has, let's say, lower quality wheels that aren't necessary for the old lights that weren't quite as heavy as some of the LEDs today. So all the ones we sell come with their heavy duty wheels, which can handle up to our largest, our 1,000 watt, the Phytomax 2 1000. So that's a nice advantage because what you have to worry about is, as Kevin was pointing out, it is a moving part, this whole thing, and things do wear out when they're moving. And so by having the heavy duty wheels, we can help reduce the chance of problems, things falling from your ceiling, things breaking, stopping, wearing out, things like that.
Well, and the light rail is actually very well designed. It's designed in such a way that even if most of the parts break, it's not going to drop your light on your plants. The only way that it can typically do that is if the rail itself fails completely because you didn't mount it properly. Or if you let the motor drive off the end of the rail because you forgot to put your thumb screws in. But they're very well made, very well designed, and as long as you use them properly, they can be very ideal for certain circumstances, but it's not something I would necessarily recommend for everyone.
Yeah, and so what would you say the minimum is? Let's say I had a 5x5, and where I do think there's some advantages if I had, let's say, maybe not a tent, but a 5x5 grow area, and I wanted just to deal with shadowing with a light. I wasn't going to want to depend strictly on bouncing the light off the walls. How far do you think you need to move a light mover back and forth to get some of the benefit of reducing kind of the shadowing effect of the leaves?
Well, any amount that the light is moving back and forth is going to give you some advantage. Only moving it back and forth an inch probably won't give you much, but 6 inches can actually make a big difference. If you're talking a plant with 6-inch leaves, moving the light back and forth, 6 inches can make the difference between a leaf completely shadowing out something underneath it and not shadowing out that leaf beneath it. So it doesn't take much to get an advantage. And again, if you have multiple lights in the area, then you get crossover light, and moving the lights is not required to get these advantages anymore. But when you have a single light in your hypothetical 5x5 foot area, moving it back and forth a foot would give you probably the 10 to 20% increase in yield that we typically see with a light mover.
Do you think this still matters dramatically with some of the new methods of deep and heavy defoliation that we're seeing that we use and some of the other growers we work with deploy now in their gardens?
So the complete defoliation is definitely one mechanism for helping increase penetration through the plant canopy. Light movers are just another, and it's not something which is an either-or thing. It's a complementary thing. Using the light mover in addition to defoliation would help increase canopy penetration even more.
So, we were talking about what are the benefits and what do we do with light movers and all this. One thing, this ties into heavily is the question we get probably more than any other single question, which is, I've got this space, whether it's 3x3, 4x4, 5x5, 2x2, doesn't matter. I've got this space and I don't know what light I should put in there. Does that affect your desires? So let's take the most common space in growing indoors, a 4x4, right? It's kind of the universal standard. Would that change, somebody comes to us and says, hey, I've got a 4x4, and somebody else comes to us and says, I have a 4x4 and I have a light mover. Would it change the amount of wattage you'd want to put in there? And how do we go about determining, again, for listeners, what is the right size light to put in a 4x4 space?
Yeah, it would not change the total amount of wattage that we would recommend. Basically, for any given area, to get the light levels to be appropriate for what they need to be for that area, we need a certain amount of wattage of light. So for 16 square feet for commercial quality yields, we would recommend 1,050 watts of our light. Now you can get that with 5 of our 210 watt lights, or you can get it with 1 of our Vitamex 2 1000 lights. Either way, you're going to get the same amount of total light over that area. The only difference is how it's distributed. So if you're using 5 of our 200 watt lights, you're going to be hanging them pretty close together in a 4x4 foot area, but by spreading out the light a little bit more, you get some of the advantages of having a light mover in terms of having the light coming in from different angles and getting better penetration to the lower leaves in the canopy. However, if you look at the logistical issues, just hanging 5 small lights in a 4x4 foot area versus 1 of our lights, larger lights, the 5 small lights is going to be much more of a pain to work around. It's going to be much more of a pain to hang up everything properly. And then it's also going to end up costing you a lot more because we had to pay for 5 housings for our lights and 5 sets of cords and 5 boxes, and everything adds up. And that's where our larger lights are more economical and more appropriate for larger areas in general. Now, adding a light mover in there can get you the same advantages as having multiple smaller lights. Again, I would not necessarily recommend a light mover in a tent just because I've seen too many issues with them, and I would be nervous about deploying one in a tent. But if you had a 4x4 foot area with a nice solid ceiling you could mount the light rail to, you can move a Vitamex 2 1000 back and forth a foot and get all of the advantages of having multiple lights, or having a light mover in there with one cheap larger light. Now, because we're still covering a 4x4 foot area with that light, though, the light would need to still be 29 inches above the tops of the plants, even though it's moving back a foot, back and forth a foot each way. So you're not gaining anything in terms of height. And in fact, the light mover is going to steal about 6 inches of height itself. So in that case, you're actually losing height, but you might get a 10 to 20% increase in yield just by eliminating shadowing to the lower leaves. It's all dictated, though, by the total amount of area that you need to cover, and the appropriate wattage for what you need to use light-wise is always dictated by the total area. So if we had a 16 square foot area that's 2 by 8 feet, one of our Vitamex 2 1000s would work ideally on a light mover to cover a 2 by 8 foot area like that. And you'd get the same yield out of that 2 by 8 foot area as you would out of a 4 by 4 foot area without the light mover. So what it can't do for you, though, is just automatically, magically make it cover twice the area. The light movers don't work that way. I mean, they can physically move the light over it, but it's not going to make the light cover that area effectively. So it always comes back to what size area do you have, and it's not necessarily what shape area you have, but what size area do you have, and that's going to dictate what wattage of light we would recommend. So for high light levels, for approximately 900 ppfd on average, our Vitamex 200 would cover a 2 by 2 foot area. Our 600 covers a 3 by 3 foot area. Our 1000 covers a 4 by 4 foot area. So that would be 4 feet, 4 square feet, 9 square feet, and 16 square feet, respectively.
So one place that, you were talking about that it's not going to stretch anything and it's not going to, add light. I was just on our calculator page on our site for the hanging height, which is in our FAQ, and it's real handy to figure this out. You've been talking about watts per square feet, but as we know as lighting guys, what we're really trying to drive to ultimately is figuring out what your PPFD is. What's the lighting intensity you want? Because sure, we can talk about watts per square feet. We can talk about all kinds of different things, but at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is hit a certain light level. Whether you're a home grower or you're a commercial grower, you should have an idea of what PPFD you're trying to hit and then work with your lighting manufacturer's information to obtain that level of light. So for example, if you take our 1000, it's a great light for a 4x4, 5x5. We love it. It brings the weight. It brings really high quality, and it's an awesome light. But what if you like the 1000 or you have 1000, you want to veg with it, and you happen to have, let's say, a 4x8 space? It's 32 square feet. Could you flower 32 square feet with our, with our 1000? Yeah, you could do it. Your yield per square foot wouldn't be real high, but you could definitely do it. But this could be a great light to use in vegging a 4x8. Again, if you deploy a light mover, as Kevin's been explaining over that, you're just going to move it back and forth to cover this 4x8 space, and you're hanging it at the proper height to cover a 4x4, and you're just kind of moving that 4x4 back and forth across your grow area. So in this case, if you use the calculator on our site, on our FAQ, you'd find if you select the Phytomax 1000, put in a 4x8 footprint, you're going to get the proper PPFD. You're going to see 501. Now this calculator does tell you need a 57-inch hanging height, which is incorrect because it doesn't know about the light mover, but the PPFD is still going to be accurate. So you could start to get an idea of how that light mover would work with our light in a 4x8 space, and you can start to feel how that's going to be. So 1000, you might think, well, it's a little big for a veg light if you're a home grower, but if you have a good sized veg because you have a lot of mothers or a lot of genetics you're keeping, and you have a 4x8, 1000 might be appropriate. It's going to be cheaper, as Kevin said, than buying a bunch of our small lights and filling up that veg area to get 1000 and move it back and forth. Again, if it's not a tent and you have a solid ceiling and things like that.
Yeah, and so with Noah using the calculator on the website, you can absolutely get the correct PPFD average by giving it the space that you're looking to cover. So the 4x8 foot space that he was just using there as an example. To get the correct hanging height, if you're going to use a light mover, you're going to want to put in a footprint, which is the minimum width of what you're doing. So if you're looking to cover a 4x8 foot space with your light mover, you want to put in a 4x4 foot footprint. If you were looking to cover a 2x8 foot space, you'd want to put in a 2x2 foot footprint, because as Noah alluded to earlier, what the light mover is doing is essentially taking that smaller footprint that the light is actually covering and physically moving that back and forth, dragging it over the area that it's actually using. So as far as the hanging height for the light is concerned, you want to aim for the smallest width of the area that you're looking to cover.
Yeah, so light movers are incredibly handy. They are a tool that every grower should know about, whether you're going to deploy them or not. If you're going to be a more advanced grower, an experienced grower, you should know their tool out there that's available for you to use. Should you use it? Do you need to use it? Not necessarily, but it's good to know it's available to you as a grower, and it's also really good to understand how they work and what they do. And so you don't get these misconceptions that they actually stretch, as we say, they stretch the footprint or stretch the light. They don't. They just reallocate the light in a different way. So they're a very good tool to have in your arsenal of tools to have for growing indoors. But again, they have a very specific use case. And as long as you know how to deploy them, as Kevin said, if you do it correctly and you think it through and you set it up correctly, they can be an excellent tool. And we do love the product that Gualala Robotics puts out, the Light Rail, the one we sell specifically I was talking about earlier is the Light Rail 3.5. They have some different models, but the 3.5 we feel works really well because even with our heaviest 50-pound light, you can actually get creative. And we didn't speak about this, but a little more product specific is they have a motor you can put on the rail, as Kevin was talking about. But then if you're going to move 2 or 3 lights, you can get these trolleys that can then be on either side of that motor to hang another light, so you can keep your costs down. If you're going to run, let's say, 3 200s in a space and you want to move them back and forth for some reason, you can cut your cost by getting one motor and using 2 trolleys, and now you're only paying for one motor, and the trolleys are obviously a lot cheaper than the motor that has all those controls Kevin was talking about to adjust how long it pauses on each end and that sort of stuff. So There are a lot of advantages. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to call us at Black Dog LED. We're always happy to help you with questions regarding light movers. We can also, if you have a setup you're going to deploy yourself, we're happy to answer questions. And if you want a sanity check to make sure you're kind of thinking it through and setting it up properly, give us a call. We'll help walk through it and make sure that you're not going to kill your plants with too much light or underdevelop them with too little light. So thanks again for joining us on the podcast today. We hope you enjoyed this installment of the Cultivation Cast. If you have any questions about the content or have a future topic, again, please don't hesitate. Email us so we can make sure and cover that. That's podcast@blackdogled.com. Podcast singular at blackdogled.com. Thanks again and happy gardening.